Hi, everyone. We're so excited you're here for this bonus episode of the Women of the Word podcast. We just weren't ready to be done with the season yet, so we have one more episode for you all, and it's going to be a good one. So, Jen, what topic could we not miss out on talking about for this episode, and who is joining us to help discuss it?
Well, so we don't often talk about the fact that what we're doing in women's Bible study is not particularly gender specific in all of its respects. Certainly, there are some considerations, but that when you talk about Bible literacy is for everyone. And so I'm really excited today to have a good friend of mine, Nathan Campbell, on the show with us. Nathan has built out men's Bible study. We were colleagues together for, I think we said 7 years, 6 or 7 years together in the same place. And he built out men's Bible study along the exact same lines that we were doing in the women's space. And we got to see so much fruit come from that. And so I figured that we have people who are listening to this, probably mostly women are listening to this podcast, who might want an episode they could give to a pastor to listen to and give some consideration to this. Or it may be that you have the ability to implement the conversation a little on your own. I think it's fair to say there was not much sweeter that happened to me in all my years of ministry than when we got to partner on having these spaces that were operating simultaneously side by side. And so, Nathan, we're so glad that you are here today. Nathan is currently, we're not serving in the same space anymore. Nathan has gone on to bigger and better things. He is the the pastor of spiritual formation at a church in the Charleston area. And so you're responsible for a lot of things now, not just the men's space. But I'm hoping today we can have a good conversation about what makes that space distinct and then also what makes it incredibly similar to the women's space.
Well, thanks for having me, Jim. I'm so excited to talk about this and just excited to be with you again. And like you said, I think the fact that we got to partner together in ministry for so long really is one of the great privileges of my ministry as well. So thanks for having me today.
Sure. Well, so when I met you, you were fresh out of seminary.
Yeah.
And how much did you care about Bible literacy when we first met each other? Was it on your radar?
It was on my radar, but not to where it is today. So when I came to the church that we used to serve at together, in a lot of ways, I came because of what you and JT and Kyle were starting to build there and wanted to be a part of that in the context of local church. And I think I came probably leaning more towards JT's space of the sort of training
Mhm.
program, deep discipleship type of material. And then I got there and quickly kind of latched on to what you were doing in women's Bible study and wanted to see the same type of thing happen with the men in their church as well. And so I think where I am today is very much in a huge fan and celebrator of all Bible study spaces.
Well, of course, I want all of the credit for your successes and none of the blame for any
Mhm,
failures that you might
mhm.
encounter along the way. But yeah, when we think about Bible literacy, you've spent a lot of time in church world seeing this play out. Do you think that it is more pronounced in one space or the other, in women's or in men's?
It's an interesting question. I think where we are today is probably where we were different from 10 years ago. So I think in a
Mhm.
lot of ways, the things that you've done or others have done in the women's Bible study space in the past 10 years or so has really helped to improve what's happening at a thought level discussion of the Bible. And I think our men's Bible study spaces are kind of 10 years behind. There's a
Mhm.
book that says, what is the scandal of the evangelical mind? That there is not one. In a lot of ways, we can say the same thing about men's Bible study spaces. What is the scandal of men's Bible study? That there is not one. I think a
Mhm.
lot of men's ministry, if they do have a men's ministry at all, will either do something like a hobby-based ministry, maybe do a men's softball league or some sort of hobby-based thing, or they'll do something that's more application focused. So it's something about being a good husband or father or an accountability group. But the kind
Yeah.
of Bible study that you've pitched and that I've kind of taken wholesale of a sort of Bible literacy approach that leads to a worship of God, I think that type of environment really is missing in a lot of churches.
Yeah, and why do you think that is? Because I mean, like, what we saw was that not just that you had strong turnout, like, you had strong, consistent turnout to the
Mhm.
tune of 550.
Mm.
Well, you ran out of space at
Right.
550 men, and
Yeah.
we were in a large church. But, like, what do you think accounts for the reasoning that's out there, like you've mentioned, that men won't come to something
Yeah.
like this?
There's so many reasons, so many layers to that. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is one of my observations from our time at our previous church was that many of the people who were coming, the younger men tended to come for the community and they stayed for the
Mhm.
teaching, where the older men tend to come for the teaching and stay for the community. And so I
Huh.
think there's some interesting dynamic going on there, even today, as we look at the landscape of the current generation of Gen Z or younger, and seeing even a change in our learning that in the 1950s, there's a sort of a 2-to-1 ratio between men and women going to college. Then in the 90s, there's a sort of 1-to-1, and today it's a 4-to-6. And so in some ways, the younger generation is even seeing this a process of learning to be not a masculine quality, but a feminine quality. And so you're starting to see even men drop out of higher education spaces, which I think is also sort of starting to pick up in the church as well. So there's a lot of different layers to it, but I think that's one layer that we can point to.
That's interesting. And I think, like about how I would say that in the women's space, the eagerness that you see among women is still coming from just a lack of having been resourced historically in the church to the degree that women would like to be. So that's a very interesting shift that might be happening right now.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So, Nathan, there might be some clear differences, even just in what kind of gets people in the door of these different studies between men and women's groups. What are some things, though, that both men and women's Bible study spaces should have in common?
Well, I would say pretty much everything except for the people. You know, pretty much all the approaches and things that we're doing are drawn from women of the word. You know, we really in men's Bible study got to run because Jen got us there. Jen walked
Mm,
so we could run. And a lot of the principles that we built in our previous church and even in my new church that I'm serving in now, the principles that I'm building both for our men's Bible study and for our women's Bible study are the same exact principles. And we saw a really beautiful dynamic happen where we used the same curriculum and we
Yeah.
had the same
mm.
approach to Bible study, or even in my own family. I can attest to, coming home on Tuesday night, having taught the men's Bible study and having a conversation with my wife, Erin, and having conversations. Hey, what did Jen teach this week? And be like, oh, smacking myself in the head. I should have taught that.
And
Um,
vice versa.
but it's created this great dynamic in the churches that we've served to be able to see the ways that families, husbands and wives, or even
Mhm.
kids, we start to see at the tail end there as well, begin to
Mm.
have the same conversation. So I think having more commonality rather than difference is really the best approach to this type of Bible study.
Well, and we spent years where all we had was women's Bible study, and then you built the men's to go along with it. So, like, we had men who were sort of like grabbing a bootleg copy of the workbook and working
Mm.
alongside the study with their wives secretly. And just to be clear to anyone listening, our church did not or did not have a position that would have made anything shameful about the men listening to my teaching. And we also are not philosophically opposed, obviously, to having men and women in Bible study together.
Mm.
The church that we were serving at, we just didn't have physical space for that, and we valued single gender spaces and decided to invest in those in the men's and women's space. But when you think about I would have the same thing happen, like, I would hear about husbands and wives saying, "Well, that's not what Jen said," or "That's not what Nathan said." And it was so funny because I think it was good for them to know there's not one way to teach this passage, and you and I are picking and choosing the emphases that we think are most relevant to the space that we're interacting with each week. But and then with regard to Women of the Word, it's been a joke since the book came out. Why didn't you call it People of the Word? And we have jokingly said if you just put a little piece of tape over the WO, it becomes Men of the Word
That's
pretty easily. Because right, I mean, you're exactly right. The mechanics of
right.
what we're doing, they're not gendered, but there are some considerations that are specific to the men's space that are different than those that are happening in the women's space. What would you say some of those are?
I think some of the more obvious ones are that men tend to, not always, but men tend to struggle more with vulnerability at a heart level discussion. And so that's been one of the interesting dynamics we've seen in the difference between women's Bible study and men's Bible study, where I think your fight and your encouragement for so long was to encourage women to have a thought level discussion around the text. And I think
Mhm.
many men are used to, probably if they're having any discussion of the text, having just a thought level discussion of the
Right.
text. And so what we really had to press on in some ways is to move them beyond just a thought level and have a heart level as well. So that's one of those
Mhm.
dynamics that the differences between the environments in my teaching or in training small group leaders, we're trying to emphasize things a little bit more to move beyond just the head to the heart.
Mm.
So whereas in the women's space, we're trying to keep everybody on track with the thoughts and not veer too often into someone's story or the prayer request, which, matter, but they need to, have their place in the conversation. You're actually dealing with the opposite problem. They don't want to move out of the thought level space. It's so interesting because I read an article just yesterday. I want to say it was an article. It might have just been someone's thoughts on a social media platform, but they were saying how yeah, men don't wanna be in an accountability group. Like, they wanna be accountable, but they wanna be accountable after they've developed safety and relationship with someone, which I think is why you see the paradigm for men's ministry typically being let's get them together to do a service project together or something like that. And I don't mind that. But would you say that in the Bible study space, you found a similar benefit of like they had a reason to gather that wasn't the vulnerability piece, but then perhaps over time that became something they were open to?
Yeah, definitely. And we saw that men, as they began to have that sort of consistency over years for a lot of small groups, they began to have really deep friendships,
Mhm.
which is so lacking in so many men, especially men as they age closer to 40. The number of close friends that men have begins to diminish drastically.
Yeah.
And so we saw that dynamic sort of shift in our spaces where men were gathering together just for fun, just to gather to have community outside of the context of Bible study. But I really think there's something to what we expect from men in men's Bible study spaces and men's ministry spaces. To steal a phrase from another context, sometimes we have the soft bigotry of low expectations for
Mhm.
men, that we expect
Mhm.
men just to be like the TV sitcom, stereotypical man or the man we see in
Mhm.
cartoons, rather than actually calling them into something. And our approach at the previous church that we were trying to do for our men is to call them into something, knowing that if
Mhm.
we aim for socialization, that maybe discipleship will happen, but it's not a guarantee. But if we aim
Mhm.
for discipleship, that socialization will happen.
Yep.
That's some of the dynamics that C.S. Lewis talks about with friendship, that friends stand shoulder to shoulder. And so when
Mhm.
these men are standing shoulder to shoulder and looking at the text together, it really formed the deeper friendships rather than just turning inwards and talking amongst themselves.
Yeah, this is really good, and it's pertinent to a lot of the work that we've done, JT and Kyle and I have done, where we find that so often churches, when they're thinking about programming, they're starting with the wrong question. They're asking, what do our people want? And instead to ask the question, how are disciples formed? You may do some of the same things in answer to both of those questions, but how are disciples formed tends to press you toward drawing people into what they might not intuitively ask of themselves. And I think, with the Bible study space in particular, if we can say with certainty, and I think we can, that Bible literacy does not know gender lines, that men and women are both facing the Bible literacy crisis on probably equal terms at this point, then to build a men's ministry that's primarily around events, which is actually, that's old school women's ministry, right? Would be as big of an error in that space as it would be in the female space to do that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And there's even, I think, an overcorrection. The topic of masculinity is so fraught in our
Yeah.
modern culture, and just to even have a
What are you
podcast
talking
on it
about? It's
feels
all
kind of
fine out there.
nerve-wracking, right?
Everything's
It's all
fine.
fine,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so it feels like some people, the best they can, have tried to respond to this confusion about what masculinity is. And in my perception, from looking at the landscape and being in that space for so long, is overemphasizing maybe the masculinity piece rather than the
Mhm.
maturity piece. And I think the type
Mhm.
of ministry that I want to be a part of isn't even primarily asking the question of masculinity, but it's asking the question of maturity,
Mm.
and something that I've even heard you say in other spaces is when Paul says, act like men. What is it? What is the opposite of a man? The opposite of a man is not a woman. The opposite of a man is a boy. It's a child.
Mhm.
And I think the call of the Christian is the call to spiritual maturity, the call to
Mm.
spiritual formation. And so the call for men is to grow in maturity, even more than just what we think of as masculinity.
What would you say are some of the markers of that maturity, and how does Bible study help them get there?
Well, I think part of it is our vision statement that was very similar, talk about the similarities between men's and women's Bible study. Our mission and vision statement was to grow in our love for God and for one another by beholding God and His Word. At its base, what we were trying to do, we wanted to behold God and His Word because we believe that when
Mhm.
we behold the glory of God, that's how we're actually transformed. The Word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword, and that's what actually transforms us. We're to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. So I think at a base level, maturity looks like learning about God, but then it also obviously looks like practicing the way of Jesus as well. It looks
Mhm.
like actually
Mhm.
embodying these ways in the world. And so many times people boil down what it means to be a man is to be a husband and a father. And
Mm.
those can certainly be a big part of a lot of men's stories. It wasn't a part
Mhm.
of our Lord's story or the Apostle Paul's story, but many men's stories that is the case. But rather, I think inhabiting the fruit of the Spirit, That's what it means to be a mature man. It means to be
Mm,
someone who's patient and doesn't fly off the handle when your team loses or when someone cuts you off in traffic. It looks like living with your wife in an understandable way so your prayers might not be hindered. Right? And we could talk about things on and on and on. But I
mhm.
think at its base, it means knowing God and then loving God and loving one another as a result.
That's good.
Hmm. Yeah. So, Nathan, what encouragement can you give to both men and women in their respective spaces in Bible study?
The first thing I would say is to keep going or to get going.
Mm,
For the women who have already been laboring in this space for years now, or who are starting these things in your church, I'll just say that it's a valuable and worthwhile place for you to serve. It's a valuable and worthwhile place for you to learn, to grow, to be more like Jesus.
Mm.
And for the men or pastors, maybe even who are listening, is to advocate for the sisters in your church, to get to know the women who are leading your women's ministries and get to know the things that we're trying to do from this podcast or Jen's book or just men's and women's Bible study in general. But I really think that these types of spaces are transformative for us. These are the types of spaces that we actually grow to know God and love God. So I would say get going or keep going.
Mm. That's good. I have to give you credit. I think you had a lot of teachability as it related to saying, "Hey, what's your playbook?" and we're going to run it. I think that can be hard. I don't know that people are always looking, that people in leadership are always looking to the pink space in the church for best practices. And so kudos to you for doing that. I would be curious. I want to circle back. There are two things I want to follow up on. The first is you talked about the difficulty that men have forming friendships. And I wondered in the women's space, I've talked about on the podcast how we preserved people's ability to stay in groups with each other, thinking that is something that you did as well in the men's space. But can you confirm or deny?
Yes, I can confirm. Um, yeah, that was a huge part of what we wanted to do as well, is not just to have a place where they can learn, that's our primary
Mhm.
stated purpose of the environment, but we also want to provide a place for community as well. You know, you've talked about in places, and I've definitely stolen it from my new church, but the values of space,
Yeah.
structure, predictability, accessibility, accountability, community, and excellence. And that
You said that
community
off the top of your head, and that makes me so happy.
That's good.
And that community
Mm,
piece is something that we really try to encourage and emphasize because we don't do this spiritual life alone and we can't study the Bible alone.
mm.
And the best we can do to encourage men to continue on this journey together, I think the more it's going to stick, the more it's actually going to transform into heart and hands level.
Mm,
So we've actually also spent a lot of time talking about the teaching piece and how does the teaching, the three-legged stool, and how does the teaching connect to the small group time and to the curriculum, the work that they're doing in the curriculum. And candidly, I helped you with finding and onboarding some of the men who were teaching in the men's space, and I found that it was a little bit challenging to get some of the men to understand what we were doing in the teaching space versus what they were perhaps accustomed to doing when they stood up on a platform behind a podium with a Bible. Any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
Yeah. For sure. So I think part of this is, especially if the men that we're asking to teach in these environments will probably be the case for most churches, are probably the pastors of our church. And so they've probably been trained in some sort of preaching class and seminary, like I was myself and really benefited from. But there's a difference between preaching and teaching, which again, I'll just say, just Google Jen and you can find some resources that'll be really helpful for you there. That's just my ministry philosophy in general. Just what did Jen say? WWJD. What did Jen say?
Gosh, I wonder why I had
Yeah.
Nathan on the podcast.
That's right. So I think there's definitely a learning element to learn how to teach and not just to preach. Now, to be candid, I am more of a preacher by default, and so some of my teaching would definitely verge into the preaching land, and honestly, some of my preaching also verges into the teaching land.
Mm,
And
mm,
so what the exact mix looks like for men or women will vary based on who that person is. But there is definitely a learning element to teach to and through the homework and not just to turn it into some sermon that doesn't actually talk about the things that people studied that week.
mhm, mhm.
mm,
Yeah, so keeping the active learning environment active by keeping it as dialogic as possible. Yeah, it was a hard sell for some of those guys, but
mm.
Yeah.
we brought them around.
And I will say too, one of the benefits was that most Thursdays, when your schedule allowed, we got to have a call, an hour-long call where we
Yes.
talked about, "Hey, I'm teaching in this passage next week. What are you teaching? And that's one of the benefits of having the same curriculum, the same study that we're doing, is it also allows that brother-sister relationship, and for me to be able to
Uh-huh.
learn from you, or hopefully occasionally I could give you something that might be
Oh my
helpful as
gosh,
well.
more than one occasion. Yeah, I mean, and
But
it's
yeah,
like, many hands make light work. It was
yeah,
so great to get to partner on that. And plus, you're looking at resources I might not have come across and vice versa.
that's
So,
right.
yeah, that was a huge plus of all of
Yeah.
it.
Mm. So, Nathan, for our listeners out there who might be hearing this and they don't have a men's study at their church, where would you encourage people to start?
Yeah. Well, without just becoming a Jen Wilkin fanboy, which I certainly am, I would just say genuinely pick up Women of the Word or listen to this podcast, which just say both to you, Laura, and to Jen, thank you for producing this podcast. It's been a joy for me even to go back and re-listen to in the recent days leading up to this conversation and just reinforcing the things that I really believe to my bones. And so I'll just say for men, if this is something that's a desire for you to start in your church, one, learn from our sisters. The Jen and others have really done a lot of foundational work that we get to build off of. So what a blessing that is for us to be able to depend on the resources that have already been created. And I'll just say again, start something. Now you got to start somewhere, but one of the best places to start is really just pick up Women of the Word, tear off the cover if you need to, if you really need to do that. But read the book because it is so helpful.
Mm.
That's good. And, and I think we would both say, for those who are listening, I run into so many churches where the men are studying something different than the women. And we saw such richness
Yeah.
come from the men and the women studying the same thing because it rolled into family, it rolled
Mhm.
downstream into family discipleship opportunities. And you've heard us talk in previous episodes about having like high school and middle school girls come to the women's study. It was the same with the men's study.
Yep.
There were a group that we had students who were coming to those spaces as well. And so just the richness of dialogue and the shared vocabulary that results from that when everybody is learning the same things. And also, frankly, economies of scale. It's very hard to oversee and vet a bunch of different curricula. It's much easier to sort of standardize things, and you're never going to miss when you go with taking people through an entire book of the Bible from start to finish. Everyone benefits. Everyone has something to learn.
Mm.
So Nathan, I'm so glad that you were on today. And
Thanks, Jen.
have you started, where are things at your own church? Are you in process on all this?
Yeah, so it is fun to be on the other side of this because having been at our previous church for 7 years, I was able to build off of your foundation that you had built for years prior, and so I really got to just benefit from that and talk about that to other churches and that kind of thing, and so now I'm on the other side. So I'm starting
Mhm.
something from scratch, and
Mhm.
so one of my first goals was to start something for the women and for the men, and so I've already built
Mhm.
those leadership teams, started to have those meetings, and so we're very much in the early stages of that, but I'm taking that playbook. I'm taking that playbook that you have developed and we helped develop together and implement it here at this church. And that I'm really excited about too, to see that there is really a hunger here and both for the men and the women to want to run after this hard. And
Mm.
so we're still trying to figure out way it looks like at our church
Mhm.
versus the church
Mhm.
that we're coming from. And that's going to be the case for everyone who's listening. And that's hard work to figure out
Mhm.
how do these principles apply in practice. But
Mhm.
it's good work and I think it's going to produce good fruit.
So good.
Yeah, agreed. Nathan, thanks so much for joining us for a really terrific conversation and just a good reminder that Bible literacy is for the whole church, men and women. So, with that, that's a wrap on season 3. Thanks to all of our listeners for joining us for this season of the Women of the Word podcast. We had wonderful guests, great conversations, really had a blast. Hope you did too. Thanks again for being here.